After watching the cameras, she discovered what her husband was doing to their autistic son. Maria adjusted the thin curtains in the living room, letting a soft beam of sunlight illuminate the quiet chaos that was her life. The scattered toys on the floor, Diego's unfinished puzzle, and Lucia's tiny shoes near the door told the story of a family that should have been whole. Yet, within the walls of her modest home, there was a silence that spoke louder than words, a tension that seeped into every corner. Diego, her 7-year-old son, sat on the rug, meticulously fitting pieces of his puzzle together. His movements were slow, deliberate, his small hands trembling slightly as he worked. Maria's heart ached watching him. She knew how much he loved puzzles, how they helped him feel calm, connected. But she also knew how much Alvaro, her husband, loathed them. Why does he always do that? Alvaro's voice echoed in her memory from countless arguments. It's like he doesn't even hear us. Like he's in his own world. Maria had tried to explain, time and time again, that Diego's autism wasn't a problem to be fixed. It was part of who he was, part of what made him special. But Alvaro had never understood. Instead, he distanced himself, showing a sharp impatience with Diego that contrasted painfully with the doting father he was to Lucia, their 2-year-old daughter. Lucia, as if sensing Maria's thoughts, toddled into the room with a wide grin. Her laughter was infectious, her energy boundless. She climbed onto the couch, clutching her favorite stuffed bear, and began babbling a string of unintelligible words. Maria smiled faintly, running a hand through her daughter's curls, but her mind was elsewhere. The idea of installing cameras had come to her on a sleepless night, lying in bed next to Alvaro's indifferent frame. She didn't just want to protect her children, she needed to. Diego's silence spoke volumes, but Maria couldn't be everywhere at once. The cameras would give her eyes where she couldn't be, a window into the moments she feared most. When she brought the cameras home, Alvaro barely glanced at them. Paranoid, he muttered, shaking his head. As if anyone would care to break into this place. Maria didn't correct him. She didn't need him to understand her reasons. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Maria sat at the kitchen table with her laptop. The cameras were simple to set up, one in the living room, another in Lucia's nursery, one in the hallway, and the last one, her most important placement, in Diego's room. She connected them all to the app on her computer, watching the grainy live feeds flicker to life. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she replayed the day's events. Diego sitting cross-legged on the rug, his face scrunched in concentration as he worked on his puzzle. Lucia running circles around him, her laughter ringing like tiny bells. Alvaro coming home late, his face twisted in annoyance as he stepped over Diego without a word. Maria sighed, her chest tightening. She hated feeling helpless, hated the gnawing guilt that whispered she should be doing more. As the feed from Diego's room filled the screen, she closed the laptop and pressed her hands to her face, willing herself to breathe. It wasn't until the following evening that Maria gathered the courage to check the recordings. It was late, the house shrouded in darkness save for the dim glow of the kitchen light. With her heart in her throat, she opened the laptop and clicked on the playback from the previous night. At first, there was nothing unusual. Diego lay in bed, his small body curled beneath his blanket. The room was quiet, still. Maria fast-forwarded, her nerves winding tighter with each passing minute. Then she saw it. Alvaro had entered Diego's room around 9 p.m., his movements abrupt and impatient. Diego, who had been playing with a small wooden toy, froze the moment his father walked in. Alvaro bent down, snatching the toy from Diego's hands. Maria's pulse quickened as she watched Alvaro's lips move, the sharpness of his tone apparent even without sound. Diego didn't react. He simply sat there, his hands trembling slightly, his gaze fixed on the floor. Alvaro dropped the toy onto the nightstand and turned away, leaving the room without another glance. Diego sat still for a long moment, his small shoulders rising and falling with shaky breaths. Then, slowly, he reached for the toy, clutching it tightly as though it were his only anchor. Maria's chest tightened, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. She rewound the footage, watching again, hoping, praying, that she had misunderstood. But the scene played out exactly as it had before. She closed the laptop, her hands trembling. The image of Diego's hunched shoulders, his silent acceptance, burned into her mind. She had always known Alvaro's patience was thin, but seeing it laid bare like this, unfiltered, undeniable, shattered something inside her. Maria spent the rest of the night in restless silence, sitting by Diego's bedside as he slept. His face was peaceful, his small hand clutching the toy that Alvaro had so carelessly dismissed. "I'm sorry," Maria whispered, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I'm so sorry, mi amor. I should have seen it sooner." But as dawn broke, Maria knew one thing with certainty: she could no longer ignore what was happening in her home. For Diego, for Lucia, and for herself, she would find the strength to face Alvaro and protect the children who depended on her. It wasn't paranoia that had driven her to install the cameras, it was love. And now, that same love would drive her to take action, no matter the cost. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Maria mechanically prepared breakfast. Her movements were precise, almost robotic, as though her mind was elsewhere, because it was. The footage from the previous night played on a loop in her head, each frame etching itself deeper into her memory. Alvaro's cold demeanor, Diego's trembling hands, the silence of it all. Lucia's laughter broke the heavy air, her tiny feet padding across the floor as she clutched her favorite stuffed bear. She tugged at Maria's skirt, her bright eyes sparkling with innocence. "Mama, hungry," she chirped, her voice a brief reprieve from the weight on Maria's chest. Maria forced a smile, crouching down to kiss Lucia's forehead. "I'm making your favorite, mi amor. Just a little longer." But as Lucia returned to the living room, Maria's eyes drifted to Diego. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his plate without touching the food. His wooden puzzle was in front of him, the same one Alvaro had snatched away the night before. He ran his fingers over the edges of the pieces, his face blank but his movements full of purpose. "Diego, mi amor," Maria said softly, sitting across from him. "How did you sleep?" Diego didn't look up. He rarely did when he was focused. "Okay," he mumbled, barely audible. Maria reached out, placing a gentle hand on his. "If something bothers you, you can tell me. You know that, right?" For a moment, Diego paused, his fingers stilling on the puzzle piece. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. But whatever he wanted to say, it stayed locked inside him. He nodded once, then returned to his puzzle, as though the moment had never happened. The sound of the front door opening broke Maria's concentration. Alvaro had come home early from his morning errands, his heavy footsteps filling the quiet house. He carried a bag of groceries, his expression set in the perpetual scowl Maria had grown accustomed to. "Good, you're awake," he muttered as he set the bag on the counter. His eyes flicked briefly to Diego before landing on Maria. "What's for breakfast?" "Eggs," Maria replied, her voice steady, though her heart raced. She felt the tension rise the moment he walked into the room, the air thickening with an unspoken weight. Alvaro's gaze lingered on Diego, his lips curling into a frown. "Still playing with that thing, huh?" he said, jerking his chin toward the puzzle. Maria stood abruptly, positioning herself between them. "He's eating," she said firmly, though her voice shook ever so slightly. Alvaro raised an eyebrow, his tone sharp. "He's too old to sit around playing all day. What is he even learning from that?" "Nothing." "Alvaro, please," Maria said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Not now." Alvaro scoffed, grabbing a mug from the cupboard and pouring himself coffee. He didn't say another word, but the tension he left in the room was palpable. Diego remained silent, his fingers tightening around the puzzle piece he held, his small frame shrinking further into the chair. Later that day, after Alvaro had left for work, Maria found herself once again drawn to the laptop. She opened the recordings from the previous day, her stomach knotting with a mixture of dread and resolve. She clicked through the hours, skimming the footage as the mundane scenes of the day played out. Lucia playing with her blocks, Diego quietly working on his puzzle, Maria folding laundry in the background. It was ordinary, almost comforting, until it wasn't. At around 3 p.m., while Maria had been in the laundry room, Alvaro appeared on the living room camera. He stood in the doorway, his posture tense as he watched Diego, who was sitting on the floor with his puzzle. At first, Alvaro did nothing. But then, after a moment, he walked over to Diego and crouched down in front of him. The soundless footage couldn't capture the words exchanged, but Maria didn't need audio to understand the dynamic. Alvaro's face was stern, his lips moving quickly as he gestured to the puzzle. Diego didn't respond. He sat frozen, his hands hovering protectively over the pieces. And then it happened. Alvaro grabbed the puzzle box and tossed it aside, the pieces scattering across the floor. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she watched Diego flinch, his entire body recoiling as though bracing for a blow that never came. Alvaro said something else, his hand gesturing sharply, before standing and walking away. Maria's hand flew to her mouth as tears blurred her vision. She rewound the footage, watching it again, each second cutting deeper into her heart. She hadn't been there. She hadn't stopped it. When Diego came into the kitchen later that evening, Maria couldn't hide the pain in her eyes. He stood quietly in the doorway, clutching his puzzle box against his chest. "Diego," she said, her voice trembling. "What happened earlier? With Papa?" Diego didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the table, sat down, and began putting his puzzle back together piece by piece. Maria knelt beside him, her hands covering his. "Mi amor, I need you to tell me. Did he hurt you?" Diego shook his head, but his silence spoke louder than words. He wouldn't, or couldn't, say anything more. That night, after putting the children to bed, Maria sat at the kitchen table with her laptop once more. She watched every second of footage, cataloging each moment, each interaction. The way Alvaro's voice always seemed harsher with Diego. The way Diego's shoulders hunched, his body curling inward whenever his father entered the room. Maria's tears fell freely as she closed the laptop, her mind racing. She couldn't unsee what she had witnessed. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Her heart ached for Diego, for the fear he must have carried every day. But beneath her grief, a spark of determination began to grow. She would not let this continue. Not for another day. Maria stood at the kitchen counter, her fingers tightly gripping the edge as she stared at the sink. The steady drip of the faucet was the only sound in the room, but it wasn't enough to drown out the noise in her head. The image of Diego, recoiling under Alvaro's harshness, played over and over in her mind. She had spent the night piecing together the footage, every frame a new stab of guilt. She had seen too much, and now there was no going back. Lucia toddled into the kitchen, her bright smile a momentary balm for Maria's fraying nerves. "Mama," she chirped, holding up her stuffed bear. "He's hungry too." Maria forced a smile, crouching down to kiss Lucia's cheek. "Then let's feed him, okay, mi amor." She busied herself with Lucia's breakfast, pouring cereal into a bowl while the little girl babbled happily. Across the room, Diego sat in his usual spot at the table, his puzzle spread out before him. He was quiet, as always, but his movements seemed slower, more hesitant. Maria walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do you want something to eat, Diego?" she asked softly. He shook his head without looking up. Maria crouched beside him, lowering her voice. "Mi amor, you know you can tell me if something is bothering you, right?" Diego paused, his fingers hovering over a puzzle piece. He glanced at her briefly, his dark eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name, fear, perhaps, or something even deeper. Then he looked away, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. The sound of the front door slamming startled them both. Alvaro's heavy footsteps echoed through the house, each one tightening the knot in Maria's stomach. She stood quickly, ushering Lucia to the living room while Alvaro strode into the kitchen. "What's this?" he barked, gesturing to the mess of puzzle pieces on the table. Maria stepped between him and Diego instinctively. "He's working on his puzzle," she said, her voice firm but measured. Alvaro scoffed, his gaze hardening as it flicked to Diego. "Still with that thing. He's too old for this nonsense. He should be learning something useful." "Alvaro, please," Maria said, her tone tinged with warning. But Alvaro wasn't listening. He reached for the puzzle, sweeping it off the table with one swift motion. The pieces scattered across the floor, some sliding under the chairs. Diego flinched, his body curling inward as though to protect himself from an invisible blow. "Stop." Maria's voice cracked as she stepped forward, her hands trembling. Alvaro turned to her, his face a mask of irritation. "What?" "He needs to toughen up. Life isn't going to coddle him." "Life doesn't need to," Maria shot back, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "Because I will." The room fell silent. Even Lucia, who had been playing in the living room, seemed to sense the shift. Alvaro's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as he stared at Maria. "What's gotten into you?" he demanded. Maria's chest heaved as she tried to steady her breathing. Her mind raced, torn between the desire to protect her son and the fear of provoking Alvaro further. "You don't get to treat him like this," she said, her voice steadier now. "Not anymore." Alvaro let out a bitter laugh. "And what are you going to do about it? You think you can handle this house, these kids, without me?" "Yes," Maria said, surprising even herself with the firmness of her answer. "Because I already do." Alvaro stared at her, his disbelief evident. For a moment, Maria thought he might lash out, but instead, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the kitchen. The sound of the front door slamming shut reverberated through the house. Maria sank into a chair, her body trembling as the adrenaline coursed through her. Diego looked up at her then, his small face etched with worry. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "No, mi amor," Maria said, her voice breaking as she pulled him into her arms. "You don't ever have to apologize. None of this is your fault." That night, after putting the children to bed, Maria sat at the kitchen table with her laptop. She opened the footage from earlier that day, her heart pounding as she watched the scene unfold. Every moment, the puzzle scattering across the floor, Diego's flinch, Alvaro's coldness, was a painful reminder of what she could no longer ignore. She replayed it again and again, each time solidifying her resolve. Alvaro had crossed a line, and she would not let him do it again. The next morning, Maria made a call. It was to her friend Sofia, someone she trusted implicitly. Sofia was a lawyer who had helped other women in similar situations, and Maria knew she would understand. "I need to get him out of here," Maria said, her voice trembling. "I can't let this continue." Sofia's voice was calm and steady. "You're doing the right thing, Maria. We'll make this happen. You're not alone in this." As Maria hung up the phone, she felt a glimmer of hope amidst the fear. For the first time in years, she could see a way out. She looked at Diego, who was once again working on his puzzle in the living room. His small hands moved with precision, his focus unbroken. "I promise you, mi amor," Maria whispered. "This will end. I'll protect you. Always." The house felt heavier than ever, every corner brimming with an unspoken tension. Maria had spent the night awake, her mind replaying every argument, every harsh word, and every moment of silence that had filled the space between her and Alvaro. She knew this was the end. Not just for him, but for the version of herself that had endured for far too long. The morning sun brought no relief. She moved through her routine mechanically, her movements deliberate as she packed a bag for Diego and Lucia. Diego sat at the kitchen table as usual, his puzzle spread out before him, though his hands moved more hesitantly than they had before. He seemed to sense the shift in the air, the unspoken plans that Maria held close to her chest. "Are we going somewhere?" Diego asked softly, breaking the silence. Maria knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "We're going to visit Sofia later," she said, her voice steady but warm. "Just for a little while. Would you like that?" Diego's gaze lingered on hers, searching for something. Finally, he nodded, though the worry in his eyes didn't fade. Lucia toddled into the room, clutching her stuffed bear, her smile a stark contrast to the tension surrounding them. "Mama, can I bring him too?" she asked, holding the bear up proudly. "Of course, mi amor," Maria said, pulling her daughter into a hug. "He's coming with us." The sound of the front door opening sent Maria's heart racing. Alvaro had come home early, his heavy footsteps echoing through the house. She straightened, her body tense as she stepped into the hallway to meet him. Alvaro looked tired, his shirt wrinkled and his jaw set in a hard line. His eyes flicked to the bag Maria had left by the door, and his brows furrowed. "What's that?" he asked, his voice sharp. Maria's heart pounded, but she forced herself to remain calm. "We're going to visit Sofia," she said evenly. "For what?" Alvaro's tone was laced with suspicion. He stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. Maria met his gaze, her voice steady. "She invited us for lunch. The kids need a change of scenery." Alvaro scoffed, his lip curling. "You think you can just leave whenever you feel like it? You don't run this house, Maria." Something inside her snapped. Maria squared her shoulders, her fear melting into a cold determination. "I may not run this house, Alvaro," she said, her voice low but firm. "But I will do whatever it takes to protect my children." Alvaro's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I know what you've been doing," Maria said, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "I've seen it. Every word, every action. It stops now." Alvaro's face darkened, his voice rising. "You're being ridiculous. I'm their father. I can discipline my son however I see fit." "Discipline?" Maria's voice broke, her anger spilling over. "You call what you've done discipline? You've humiliated him, broken his spirit, made him feel like he's worth nothing. That's not discipline, Alvaro. That's cruelty." Alvaro took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Watch your tone, Maria. You don't know what you're talking about." Maria didn't flinch. She held her ground, her voice unwavering. "I've seen the recordings, Alvaro. I know everything. And I'm done pretending it's okay." For a moment, Alvaro faltered. His eyes darted to the living room, where Diego sat silently, his head bowed over his puzzle. He opened his mouth to speak, but Maria cut him off. "You need to leave," she said, her voice steady and final. Alvaro's expression hardened. "You think you can make me? This is my house." "No," Maria said, her eyes blazing with determination. "This is their home. And you're not welcome here anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Alvaro stared at her, his disbelief evident, but Maria didn't waver. Finally, with a bitter laugh, he grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Maria sank onto the couch, her body trembling as the adrenaline began to fade. Lucia crawled into her lap, her small arms wrapping around Maria's neck. Diego walked over, his puzzle piece still in his hand, and sat beside her. "Is Papa gone?" Diego asked quietly. Maria nodded, pulling him close. "Yes, mi amor. He's gone." Diego rested his head on her shoulder, his small body relaxing against hers. "Are we safe now?" Maria kissed the top of his head, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she whispered. "We're safe now." That evening, Maria called Sofia to tell her what had happened. Sofia reassured her that she had made the right choice, that there were resources and support available to help her navigate the next steps. But for now, Maria was content to sit with her children, the weight of the day giving way to a fragile sense of peace. As she tucked Diego into bed, he reached for her hand. "Thank you, Mama," he said, his voice small but sincere. Maria smiled through her tears, squeezing his hand gently. "Always, mi amor. Always." For the first time in what felt like forever, the house was quiet, not with tension, but with the promise of a better future. And as Maria lay in bed that night, she finally allowed herself to hope. The morning after Alvaro's departure brought a stillness that Maria hadn't felt in years. The house, once suffocated by tension and fear, seemed lighter. Sunlight poured through the windows, bathing the living room in a golden glow. For the first time, Maria noticed the small things, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the sound of Lucia's giggles echoing down the hallway, and the quiet contentment in Diego's movements as he sat at the kitchen table. Maria watched him as she poured herself a cup of coffee. He was focused on his puzzle, his small hands moving with confidence that hadn't been there before. She knew the scars of the past wouldn't disappear overnight, but this was a start. "Diego, mi amor," Maria said softly, taking a seat beside him. "How do you feel today?" He paused, his fingers stilling on a puzzle piece. He looked at her, his dark eyes steady and searching. "I feel okay," he said finally. "But it's quiet." Maria smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Quiet can be good, don't you think?" Diego considered her words, then nodded. "Yes. I think I like it." Lucia's tiny feet pattered across the floor as she ran into the room, clutching her stuffed bear. "Mama, look," she exclaimed, holding up a drawing she had made. Maria took the paper, her heart swelling as she examined the scribbles of colorful shapes. "It's beautiful, mi amor," she said, pulling Lucia into her lap. "It's us," Lucia explained, pointing at the figures on the page. "Mama, me, and Diego." Diego leaned over to look at the drawing, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You forgot the puzzle," he said, his tone teasing. Lucila giggled, grabbing a crayon to add a small square beside Diego's figure. Maria laughed softly, her chest warming at the sight of her children working together, their laughter filling the room. The sound of her phone buzzing broke the moment. Maria glanced at the screen and saw Sophia's name. She excused herself, stepping into the hallway to take the call. "Maria," Sophia's voice was calm but purposeful. "I've filed the paperwork. Alvaro has no legal grounds to return, but will be prepared if he tries anything." Maria exhaled, relief washing over her. "Thank you, Sophia. I don't know what I would have done without you." "You're stronger than you think," Sophia said warmly. "You've done everything to protect your children. That strength is all yours." After the call ended, Maria leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. She allowed herself to feel the weight of everything she had been carrying, the fear, the guilt, the helplessness, and then, slowly, she let it go. That afternoon, Maria decided to dismantle the cameras. She stood in Diego's room, her hands hesitating as she reached for the device perched above the door. The camera had been her shield, her way of knowing what happened when she wasn't looking. But now, she realized, she no longer needed it. As she lowered the camera, Diego walked in, watching her with quiet curiosity. "Why are you taking it down?" he asked. Maria knelt to his level, placing the camera on the floor. "Because I don't need it anymore," she said. "I'm here now. I'll always be here for you." Diego studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." That evening, after dinner, Diego approached Maria with a drawing of his own. It was simple but full of meaning, a picture of their family standing together in the middle of their home. Above them, Diego had drawn a small sun shining down, its rays reaching every corner of the page. "What's this?" Maria asked, her voice catching as she held the drawing. "It's us," Diego said quietly. "Happy?" Maria pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Yes, mi amor," she whispered. "We're happy now." As she tucked Diego and Lucia into bed that night, Maria felt a peace she hadn't known was possible. She kissed them both on their foreheads, lingering for a moment as they drifted off to sleep. When she returned to the living room, Maria sat on the couch, the house silent around her. But it wasn't the oppressive silence of the past. It was the silence of safety, of a new beginning. She picked up Diego's drawing, tracing the lines of the sun with her fingers. Her heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and determination. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she knew now that she had the strength to face it. For her children, for herself, for the life they deserved, Maria would ensure this peace was lasting. And as she turned off the lights and climbed into bed, she carried with her the quiet certainty of a promise fulfilled.